Welcome to part 2 of chapter 7, the chapter on GDP. In chapter 1, we did the simple approach to calculating GDP, and we're going to start this video off by discussing the expenditure approach. Expenditure approach to calculating GDP. And the reason why the expenditure approach is done, you might be wondering why have two approaches? Why not just choose one and teach that? Well, the simple approach allows us to really see how GDP, where it's supposed to come from, and it allows us to do real GDP. But the expenditure approach shows us a more reasonable way to do it. So the simple approach would be the perfect way to do it in a perfect world. The expenditure approach is more realistic and more of how it's actually typically presented, with the big downside that we can't do real GDP with the expenditure approach. We'd have to figure out another way to do it, by using CPI or something. So this is what you're more likely to see if it's, say, discussed on the news or something like that. And here's the formula for it. So what we're doing is we're breaking GDP down into different components, and then we'll solve for those components, where Y is the gross domestic product, GDP. Okay. We use Y for GDP because it also is what we use for income. Some of the letters we choose in economics are kind of strange, but I is used for so much already, often for investment. For incomes, it could be potentially used for a lot of different things. So Y is the letter we use to catch all for total production. GDP and income are the same. This is an important thing to realize. If I'm paid $100 for a project, let's say somebody pays me $100 to maybe do some tutoring. Okay, so somebody pays me $100 to help them out for a few hours in economics. I would get paid $100 for that. Correctly so. It's a final service. The consumer's purchasing it for $100. So it's $100 worth of production, and it's also $100 worth of income that I earn. So GDP and income are equivalent. They measure really the same thing. So Y works for both GDP and income. All right, so that's the left-hand side variable there, GDP. The things that determine GDP are C, I, G, and NX, where C is consumption. This is just typical household consumption. Go to the grocery store and you buy some stuff to make smoothies. That goes into GDP in terms of consumption. I is investment. I'm just going to write that down for now. We need to clear the whole board out and explain that in a little more detail. G is government spending. That's when the government at the local, town, county level perhaps, state, or national, federal level, okay? So any type of government spending, as long as there is production involved. So this is any government spending as long as there is a final product. We mentioned on the last video that Social Security is not counted in GDP because Social Security doesn't involve any production. That's just taking money from one group and giving it to another. There's nothing being produced. But instead, let's say that the government, perhaps in Atlanta, builds a bunch of new biking trails like it has been doing. That is GDP. It's spending money to create something that people are going to use. Okay, now they're not necessarily paying for it, but it is production and it's in its final use, right? So that belt line that they have going around Atlanta, that counts in GDP and it goes into government spending. And then the last component here is net exports. This is exports minus imports. Okay? And I'm just going to write that down now, and when we get through with income, we'll come back to it, or rather when we get through with investment here, we'll come back to it. So that's how we calculate GDP in the expenditure approach. Obviously the math here is very easy, right? All I can do is just give you these variables and ask you to solve for the missing variable. So the math is the easy part. The harder part is really understanding what is in each of these components, okay? The reason why this approach is simple and what makes it a more realistic way to do in the real world is to solve for consumption is pretty easy. You go to a place like Walmart and you say, how much total revenue did you have last year in the U.S.? Now I don't have to think about it on a per product basis. If I just ask Walmart, how much revenues do you have? That's all their goods, right? All of their goods go into that revenue figure, and I can put it into consumption. It's a lot easier than going product by product and trying to figure out exactly what's produced. So this is just a more reasonable way to solve for it when you're doing it in the real world. It's just simply more realistic and reasonable. Okay, so there is our formula. I'm going to leave that up there. We need to talk about investment, and we need to talk about net exports. And investment includes a few different things. Includes the following. In no particular order here. And this can get a little confusing. This isn't the simplest thing in the world here. Capital goods that are produced this year would be counted in this year's GDP. This is confusing because we learned in the last video that GDP measures only final goods and services and that it explicitly doesn't include capital. This is an interesting problem. The issue here is, let's say that, for example, let's say that I buy a bulldozer for $100,000 in 2018 and then use it for production until 2030, right? So I've got like 12 or 13 years worth of use out of this bulldozer. The interesting problem with this is there is $100,000 worth of production that happened in 2018. And even though it's an intermediate good, that needs to be counted in 2018. The interesting thing, though, is, let's say in 2019, this bulldozer allows me to produce an extra 10 grand worth of materials, right? So I buy the bulldozer for 100 grand in 2018, and in 2019, I use the bulldozers to generate $10,000 in revenue. Well, what actually needs to happen is that $10,000 needs to be subtracted off of the 2019 GDP, okay? Because that $10,000 is the response of the bulldozer in 2018. Okay, so some of that production is actually based on what happened in 2018. So this is just to make sure that things get counted in the right year. Okay, to give you another example, let's say that I construct a building for $10 million this year, and then I use it for 50 years after that. The GDP actually, even though that building that I'm using for my business is capital, I need to count that $10 million today, in this year, because it was produced this year. And then next year and the year following and so forth, when that building gets used and creates value, I need to actually subtract that value out. So if that building allows me to make an extra $1 million in revenues next year, $1 million of those dollars actually need to be taken out because it was actually the 2018 production of the building that was responsible for that action. So this is all about making sure that things are getting accounted to the right period. If I didn't do this, then basically the 2018 production would be underestimated because it wouldn't include all of this production here that we had to do to create the bulldozer in the first place. Similar to that, a similar concept is the production of goods sold, the production of goods produced this year but not sold this year. So for example, let's say that that I produce a car, a brand new car, in 2018, and then I sell it in 2019 for $35,000. What year should this go into GDP? Remember, GDP measures total production of all final goods and services. So actually, this car, even though it was sold in 2019, should be counted in 2018. And this is a very common process for businesses, right? To not sell things the year that they happen to be produced in. So this would actually be counted in GDP in inventories, right? Through those investments. So it would fall into that investment category. And then when it gets sold in 2019, we would actually not count it then, okay? So we'd actually, if it gets added to GDP in 2019, we would actually need to explicitly go in and take out all those cars that were produced in 2018. This is done to make sure things fall into the right year. And why go through all of this work? Part of the reason is because when the economy tends to slow down, businesses build up a bunch of inventories. So back during the recession that we had back in 2008, 2010, and in that period, which we'll talk a lot more about in a later chapter, automobile companies in particular were producing a lot of vehicles and not being able to sell them yet. If we hadn't counted them, it would have made GDP look even worse than it really was, right? They're producing a bunch of cars in 2008, but they don't sell them. That should be counted in GDP. If we didn't count them, it would make GDP look way worse than it really was because the production was happening. They were producing the cars. They were hiring the employees to produce the cars and so forth. So it needs to be counted in that year. And then the third thing that's included here, by the way, you can call this inventories, right? Goods that are produced but not yet sold. We could call these inventories. So in the book, that's what they refer to them as. The third thing that's included here is new residential housing. And this is put into investment sort of under the same logic as the production of goods that are produced, or capital goods rather, that allow for value in the future. This is put into an investment simply because when you buy a house, it's not like consumption, right? When you buy a house, it doesn't feel like consumption. It feels more like you're investing. You're buying a house so you can use it for many years. So that, just for accounting purposes, is put into an investment. Not as important as these other two categories. So that's why we need investment, to calculate those things there. Trying to make sure everything's counted in the right place so that each year is accurately portrayed. The other thing we need is net exports. Net exports is exports minus imports. To show why this is necessary, let me give you an example. We'll do two examples here. So let's say I buy a $20,000 Japanese car from maybe Mitsubishi. I think that's a Japanese company. I don't hear much from them anymore. But let's say I buy a $20,000 Japanese car. Think about what that's going to do. The first thing that's going to do is actually make consumption go up by $20,000. So you're going to get $20,000 in new consumption. So if I stop there, GDP would go up. But this shouldn't count in GDP because this isn't produced in the United States. So if I just leave it just like that, this is going to give me a bad estimate. So I need something to deduct it off. Well, that net exports component, again, is exports minus imports, as they put in the book. Exports minus imports. So what's going to happen is we end up with $20,000 in extra imports. Okay? And this is deducted from GDP. Okay? Since there's a negative sign here, this net exports component here, all right, is going to get a negative $20,000 created to it. So consumption goes up by 20 grand, net exports goes down by 20 grand, so this offsets. So the reason we need the net exports category is simply just to account for these sorts of conditions. Okay? Let me give you a second example, which is actually more straightforward than that one. And let's say that Apple sells $40 million in products to Spain, for example. Well, if I don't have net exports in here, this is simply just not going to show up. It's not consumption because it's not consumed in the U.S. It's not investment. It's not government spending, so it's not going to show up. Where it's going to show up is in that net exports category, right? Exports minus imports. We'll get an extra $40 million in exports, an extra $40 million in net exports, and thus an extra $40 million in GDP. So all that does, all this net exports component is doing is just making sure that the things get counted that should be counted. Okay, so that pretty much does it for the expenditure approach. Let's see what else we need to talk about here. What I've written up here on the board is that GDP is a tool for economic comparison. So that's what we're going to do, is a little bit of economic comparisons. This is something that's a lot more fun to do when I'm teaching in front of a class and I can interact with you guys, because it's interesting to see what people think in terms of GDP. So what we might try to do is rank the top countries in total GDP. Okay? So let's see if we can figure out what countries would have the highest GDPs. I just about have these memorized. To make sure I've got them right, I'm going to look at my cheat sheet here. And this is based on 2016 data. So what country do you think has the highest GDP? This is an important question because the country with the highest GDP means they have the most total production. It's important for a lot of reasons. It means they're economically powerful. It also can mean their military is powerful as well. If they've got a lot of production, that means they have a lot of resources as well. So what country do you think is at the top? Are you thinking China? China's not number one. It's the United States is number one. And our total GDP as of 2016, okay, remember this is 2016 data, is at about 18.6 trillion. We're probably getting close to 20 trillion now, to be honest. So that puts us in number one. Number two is China at about 11.4 trillion. China is growing. China will go to number one probably here in 5 or 10 years. Not really a big deal. A lot of people see that as a negative. Economists generally see that as a positive. When countries get wealthier, that tends to be a good thing for everybody, actually. If you don't believe that, I want you to think about China's relationship with the U.S. Is China better off if the U.S. is strong? The question is obvious, right? The answer to that is obvious. Of course they are. China has benefited tremendously from the U.S. They've been able to sell a lot of products from the U.S. They've been able to take advantage of medical developments that we've created in the U.S. and so forth and so forth. The same thing happens both ways. As people get wealthier, it tends to be good for everybody. It's no different than saying, is it good for Atlanta if Montreal gets wealthy? And the answer is probably it is, because with wealth comes new inventions, new developments, and generally a reduction in things like pollution and such. Usually when countries get very wealthy, they actually reduce pollution, carbon emissions, and things like that. So it's usually good for everybody when people are wealthy. Rounding out the top five here, number 3 is Japan, number 4 is Germany, and number 5 is the UK. Going down this list, if we continued, number 10 is Canada, number 15 is Mexico, and then all the way down at the bottom, based on the ranking system that I'm looking at, if you try to look at this online, you're probably going to find different numbers because these are all ultimately estimates, and some websites have different estimates in terms of the countries they include and that sort of thing. There's only so much data available. The last ranked country is Tuvalu, which has a GDP of only 32 million. And I don't know if you've heard of Tuvalu. The only reason I know about them is because of this ranking list. So there's your rankings in GDP, just looking at the top and the bottom. This is interesting because it does show you the biggest economies, but there's kind of an obvious flaw here, right? Countries that have a lot of people are going to automatically have a lot of GDP. The bigger they are economically, or bigger they are in terms of population, the easier it is to be near the top of this list. So what would be a better way to think about this? If we're trying to figure out how wealthy countries are, what would be a better way? Per capita GDP would probably be a better way to think about this. So let's think about this in terms of per capita GDP. And this is much more difficult to identify the top 5. Because here you can basically think about the big countries and narrow it down, and that made it a lot easier. Per capita is a lot more difficult. So what do you think is number 1? Number 1, according to my list here, and again, you may see something different, so don't send me an email and say what you told me was wrong. No, it's just based on different estimates, okay? Every estimate is different. Number 1, according to the list I'm looking at here, is Luxembourg, which is a European country, a small European country that is known really for being quite wealthy. And they have a per capita GDP of about 102,000. So what that means is the average resident earns about $102,000 a year. And that includes, senior citizens and infants and everybody. It's just on average, each person produces that much, which is really pretty incredible to think about. Down the list here, here's our top 5. Number 2 is Switzerland. Number 3 is Qatar or Qatar. Number 4 is Norway. And number 5 is the U.S. One of these is not like the other, right? Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, these are all European countries. And the U.S. was developed by Europeans, right? Almost entirely, right? So U.S. was developed by people from England and Portugal and Spain. And of course you have Native Americans too. But if you think about the economic development of the U.S., it's all European in orientation. Qatar, on the other hand, is a Middle Eastern country. These countries here are wealthy because they produce a lot of services, good education systems, and that sort of thing. Qatar is wealthy largely because of tremendous natural resources, namely oil. And 1, 2, 4, and 5 would be very different places to live than Qatar. Qatar has a lot more income inequality than these countries here. So that's the top 5. You might be wondering, where is China? China is actually way, way down the list. Number 66 is Mexico. Mexico's per capita GDP is about 9,000. Compared to the U.S., which I meant to mention, the U.S. is 56,000. So what that means is the average person in the U.S. is about 6 times more productive as the average person in Mexico. But the average person in Luxembourg is almost twice as productive as the average American. And it's kind of, this is quite an economic puzzle because people are almost all the same in terms of their capabilities. Meaning you might be tempted to look at this and say, well, maybe the people in Mexico are simply less capable than the people in Luxembourg. Maybe they're just born with less skill. That's not the case. People are born with pretty much all having the same capabilities with only minor differences between races and genders and things like that. We all have about the same ability to produce economically. So this is due to other reasons, okay? And as an economist, this is very frustrating because there's no reason why there has to be such disparity. To be clear, the fact that Luxembourg is very wealthy is not hurting Mexico. Rather, all of these countries that are at the bottom could be doing just as well as Luxembourg. There's really not anything in terms of their personal abilities that's holding them back. It has to do with the way the governments are oriented, their past, things like that tend to be the problems. Continuing down the list, according to this list, 72 is China at about $8,000 per resident. They're shooting up this list, though, as well. China's developing very quickly. They're moving into a more capitalistic society, and wealth is growing over time. And if we go all the way down to the bottom here, according to my ranking, 185 is the country of South Sudan. And their per capita GDP is about, according to this, $221. $221. Got to take that with a grain of salt, though. The thing about this is, as we mentioned in the last video, poorer countries tend to do more non-market production. So if you went to South Sudan, you'd see a lot more people growing their own fruits and vegetables, maybe doing some hunting and some fishing for food, maybe helping families out in terms of repairs, building houses, things like that. So if me and a group of friends get together and build a house, and we just help each other, we don't pay each other, that doesn't go into GDP, okay? So there's a lot more of that sort of stuff going on here. Whereas if you go to Luxembourg, there's probably not many people building houses for themselves, a lot more people, paying for the things that they're going to do in their life. That being said, there's still quite an amazing amount of diversity here. That difference in non-market activities can only explain so much. So really a very key economic question is, why is there such a wide range of per capita GDPs? And to answer this question, which is really quite an important question, we need to go back to those 4 factors of production. Do you remember those 4 factors of production? In no particular order here: capital, labor, natural resources, labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurship. All right? Right? That's those 4 factors of production back from chapter 1. These are the things that determine production, and there are things that can influence these, all right? But these are ultimately what we need. So let's think about it. A country like Luxembourg versus a country like South Sudan. Capital. Why would capital in Luxembourg be so much higher than in South Sudan? A lot of it has to do with conflict. South Sudan has had continuous conflict over recent years. They very poor political setup, a lot of revolutions, regime changes, a lot of wars. Luxembourg hasn't had a major war for a really long time, and I'm not much into history, and I'm not sure if they're involved in World War II or not, but they definitely haven't had anything since World War II, any major conflicts. That makes it a lot easier for capital to accumulate, because when you have wars, that destroys capital. That destroys buildings, destroys things in the buildings, destroys everything, right? If you can avoid that, you can create a lot more capital. Also, if you can avoid conflict, it incentivizes the creation of more capital. If you're in South Sudan, you might not want to build a nice house because you're afraid it's going to get destroyed. If you're in Luxembourg, you're thinking your house is much more stable, so you're more likely to build a house, more likely to invest in your company, more likely to invest in capital. And when capital gets invested, it tends to stick around. So if you build something, it tends to stick around for a long time. Future generations can benefit from it, okay? So it allows for more profits, more revenues, more GDP. Labor. Comparing these 2 countries, education systems are going to be a lot better in Luxembourg. The average life expectancy is also a lot higher in Luxembourg, which is very important for a couple reasons. One, when people live longer and they think they're going to live longer, they tend to invest more in themselves. So for example, imagine if you knew you were going to die a year from now. You probably wouldn't be sitting here taking this class, right? It wouldn't be worth your time because you wouldn't get to enjoy the benefits. Now conversely, imagine if you knew you were going to live for 500 years. You'd probably be going to college for, undergrad, grad school, post-grad school, right? You'd be going to all kinds of colleges. You'd be learning as much as possible because you have a lot of years to take advantage of what you've learned. So people in Luxembourg know they're going to live longer on average, so they're more likely to invest in themselves than people in South Sudan. Furthermore, as people work more, as they live longer and have more chances to work, they also tend to become more productive, right? People with experience are more productive than people without experience. So living a long time, having good health care is all tied into strong labor markets. Natural resources, honestly, doesn't matter as much as you might think. Natural resources can put you near the top, like Qatar, but countries that have poor natural resources can also be near the top. In Luxembourg, their natural resources aren't especially strong. It's a landlocked country, so they don't have access to any oceans or anything directly. They don't have a particular bounty of minerals or precious metals or anything like that, but they can still be at the top of this list. And then lastly, entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship tends to do best when government restrictions are pretty lax, right? Entrepreneurship is the ability to develop these 3 groups to create a business. Countries that are able to have really strong entrepreneurship tend to be more productive because they start new businesses, create more innovation, which leads to growth in the future. So place like Luxembourg is going to be a really good place for entrepreneurship because it's easy to start a business. It's easy to borrow money, right? Most businesses begin by borrowing money. So it's pretty easy to borrow money in Luxembourg, so it's easy to be productive. Same thing in the U.S., right? If I want to start a business, I could probably find people to loan me money, banks to loan me money so quickly. Not all countries have that luxury, which makes it a lot harder for entrepreneurs to be successful. Okay, I think I got one more thing I want to talk about here in Chapter 7. In this class, we got a lot that we're covering here in the first week. We may come back to these chapters in the future and talk about a few things that I kind of want to discuss. But I'm hesitant to make these videos too long because I'm afraid you just won't watch them if I make them too long. So let me do one more thing. Let's talk about business cycles. As good as time as any to talk about business cycles, and I believe the book does put this in Chapter 7. What we're basically discussing here is the rise and fall of GDP over time. And if you look at GDP over time, all right, so here's time, and maybe this is, I'm making this up, so I'm gonna choose future dates here. If you look at GDP over time, what does it look like? All right, and let's let this be real GDP, meaning after accounting for inflation. All right, what do you think GDP does over time in the U.S.? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it flat? Well, it's growing. We have years sometimes where it decreases, sometimes it grows, but over time it tends to grow at kind of a slow and steady rate, like that. All right. But in reality, GDP doesn't grow so consistently, and instead really looks more like this through time. You have these wiggles up and these wiggles down. And so this is the actual GDP, and this is kind of like the dotted line here is kind of like a long-run trend. And so what we're going to talk about more in the future is these swings, because these swings are very important. But I just want to mention it now so we understand GDP and how it grows over time. GDP tends to grow at a pretty slow and steady rate in the long run, meaning if we look 20 years into the future, we can actually give a pretty good estimate of what GDP is going to look like. If we look 1 year into the future, we can give a pretty good estimate, but over a 1 year period, it could go up or could go down. It's kind of like owning stocks, right? If you understand finance at all, if you buy a diversified portfolio of stocks, you can be pretty confident 20 years from now it's going to be worth a lot more than it is today. But it's kind of hard to know what it's going to be worth 1 week from now because of these short-term fluctuations. GDP is not that volatile, but it does have some short-run volatility that makes it look like this. So we're going to talk in the future about why this is the case. Why does it grow and why does it shrink? But I wanted to just give you a quick note here of what we call some of these periods. When the GDP is growing, we call that expansion. When the GDP is falling, we call that contraction. And the term that you might hear a lot in the news in response to these changes in GDP is the word recession. Okay, and I want to define that real quick. This will be the last thing that we're going to cover in this chapter for now. We may come back and do a little bit more. A recession. It's interesting teaching this class because a lot of these terms you've heard, a lot of these terms you have a decent idea what they mean, but you don't know exactly what it means. Unemployment rate, you probably didn't know exactly what it meant. GDP, you probably didn't quite know what it meant, how it was calculated. Recession, I'm sure you know means a bad economy, but it has a specific definition, okay? This is not normative, this is positive. We're either in a recession or we're not, and there's nothing to debate because a recession is this. 2 or more consecutive quarters of declining real GDP. That's a recession. If we have real GDP drop 3 quarters in a row, that's a recession. Okay? Now, if you're looking at that, you might be wondering, 2 consecutive quarters or more. Well, a quarter is a quarter of a year. So 2 consecutive quarters, why not just say half a year? Well, here is the logic behind that. Right now it's 2018 quarter 3. So let's imagine this is what it looks like between now and the beginning of 2019. I'm making these numbers up, but this is about where we would start, about 19.6 trillion in our GDP. But let's say it does this. Is that a recession? At the beginning of 2019, are we in a recession? The answer is no, okay? So even though the real GDP over a half-year period has gone down, it went down and came back up, so it's not a recession. A recession, the GDP would have to drop 2 consecutive quarters. The reason why we think of it that way is if GDP goes down and comes right back up, it looks like the economy is recovering, okay? But if it continues to drop, it looks like the economy is not recovering. So that's the definition of a recession. You just need to know it, okay? Memorize it so that you know it, not just for this class, but for other classes that you take, and so that you know it in the real world. I get frustrated when I hear people arguing about recessions, and you guys, the age group you're in right now is interesting. You guys, we haven't had a recession for a while now, back since 2009, 2010. But when we have recessions, people talk about it a lot. It becomes a very common discussion topic. So what you'll hear next time we have a recession is we'll get out of it and people will say, no, I think we're still in a recession. It's hard to find work. We're still in a recession. Now, determining how hard it is to get labor doesn't really have anything to do directly with in a recession. We can be in a recession, but it can be easy to find a job. Or we can have a horrible recession, we can have, like back in 2010, a bad economy, but we're not technically in a recession because things are starting to improve. So you just need to know what a recession is, and that's it. You might also be wondering, what is a depression? Depression doesn't really have a true economic definition. It's kind of a term just for like a really bad economic period. So there's no like true definition for that. On average, we have recessions about 7 or 8 years, but that doesn't really mean we're due for one. It doesn't work that way, right? It's not like waiting on a bus and, you know, if it's been 10 minutes, it's going to come back around. It's more just kind of random when they show up. So at any second it could begin, but there's no particular reason to think that will happen anytime soon. Okay, well that's the end of chapter 7.